About you guys, but I personally enjoy other people's birthdays much more than my own, and so it being James Joyce's birthday today, I figured what a great opportunity to get to talk about Finnegans Wake again. Uh, and so I think where I want to start is in 1929 or 1930 or 1927, depending on the source. Um, Historians are going to be on red alert now for the very flimsy standing that this story has, but apparently James Joyce and Sergei Eisenstein met each other in Paris, and they discussed the filmic interest that James Joyce had, as well as the filmic qualities of Ulysses and the troubles that may ensue in trying to adapt Ulysses to film, as well as Eisenstein laying out some of his earlier ideas for his never to be completed adaptation of Karl Marx's Das Kapital. Now, the descriptions for Eisenstein's Das Kapital are nothing short of astounding. One of my friends said that what I had sent him reminded him of Symbiosis Taxiplasm. I think I got it right. Me personally, I really felt like it was in this kind of liminal space between Koyaanisqatsi and a Bela Tarr film, as well as trying to balance some of the multi-frame, in-frame ideas that Abel Gance had explored in Napoleon. And I think really Abel Gance's Napoleon has to be one of the kind of inceptions for the idea of adapting Das Kapital for Eisenstein. I feel like, you see the great image of the liberal world that we still to a degree largely exist within, being represented in this singular figure, and so the idea of being able to usurp the dominant ideology in the film art must have been really really enticing to him, and obviously this film would have put Russia on the map as far exceeding any other country's film output. And these brief descriptions of torrents of matter and turmoil that were going to be reconstituted through the edit as this unified alienation that is being experienced through unfettered production. It surely was enticing to Eisenstein, but I think really there was this minimalist aspect to his mind that was going and saying how great it would be to evince the greatest socialist realist story out of the simplest objects and the simplest cuts. And this utopic idea of what film could do was still incredibly widespread in the 1920s and 30s. And to a large extent, literature still shared in this idea. And largely, I felt like it did. Obviously, there's the postmodern artists that kind of reconcile with the end of the world, but I realized so much of what drew me to modernism when I was young was not necessarily the Sartrean existentialism, but more of the life-affirming Hermann Hesse type of modernism. And because there is this kind of distinction in modernism that it takes place on two vastly different worlds of use of technique and quality of substance, and obviously the movement picking up speed amidst some of the most revolutionarily and tumultuous moments in modern history, this meant that these aspects of artistic development were going to be called into question, especially in the newly developed USSR. Now, initially a huge fan of Joyce, Eisenstein was unfortunately forced for ideological reasons to construct a criticism of the modernist movement. And he does actually have an interesting critique of James Joyce, but I feel like it kind of boils down to the simple idea that because the book is a bourgeois medium, mostly being read by bourgeois readers, and typically the modernist author is writing very, very erudite prose that is not typically consumed by the worker, that it means that the books are struggling under the weight of the medium and the audience to produce a content that is revolutionary. And Eisenstein thinks that film has kind of freed us from that. He thinks that the techniques of film and the affordability of film, and obviously we see that related now to the ubiquity of digital filmmaking, digital cameras. He felt that it freed us from the technical and systemic constraints on the book, the word, and publishing as a industry. Now, Eisenstein was definitely one of the more softer critics of Joyce's work. George Lukács goes on to say that he finds Joyce and the general modernist movement to be completely obfuscatory and really unworthy of being on the same plane as the literary realism that he likes, such as Henri de Balzac. Now, the problem that that was related to me through the essay I read, Reason and the Balance, was that the stream of consciousness doesn't, for Lukács, it doesn't seem to actually pinpoint the economic or systemic aspects of the dehumanizing factors in modern life. Rather, he thinks that stream of consciousness universalizes suffering into something that is amorphous or undefined. The emphasis of textual inventions and syntactical idiosyncrasies just get in the way and distract from meaning and world building for Lukács. And all of this builds up to say that a lot of these modernist artists are making work that is alienating to an already alienated audience. And why would we want to make the working class work for their leisure? Now, I for one really wish that these people would have been able to get the chance to read Finnegans Wake, because I think it dispels and lambasts a lot of the tropes that modernism kind of takes for, that turns into cliches. It makes fun of these. It makes light of how literature develops these cliques, so to say, and that an artist has to kind of drift between them in order to actually do something subversive. And this kind of reminds me a lot of the conversations I've had with friends about their reading of Infinite Jest and David Foster Wallace's writing, that he seems to be simultaneously entertaining in a sarcastic manner the literary cliques, but also trying to float between them and try to find a place that is that is fitting for him. And that's where a lot of this angst and anxiety and pent up rage and despair comes from and foments into the prose. Unfortunately, a lot of these critics either died or, for ideological reasons, were completely opposed to reading Finnegans Wake, so they never actually got to experience what Joyce's comment was on the modernist movement. And I think what we get to see is someone very much with their eyes wide open, seeing how all of these techniques and inventions have been turned into cliches and are being used to manipulate the reader more than engage them. And whereas the 19th century novel is, kind of stuck within this state-sanctioned syntax, Finnegans Wake completely breaks down not only that mold of literary realism, but this entire mold of the bourgeois sense of things, this inability to communicate or see the social mechanisms, to see the what or the why of the exploitation that is taking place in the world. And this is essential to Eisenstein's problem with the novel, which he thinks that it either takes too much effort to elicit that it disengages the reader, or is incapable completely of achieving it at all. However, Finnegans Wake achieves this by the third paragraph on the first page. The fall, and then we have the 100-letter thunder word, which I'll embarrass myself reading at another time. The fall of a once Wall Street old par is retailed early in bed and later on life down through all Christian minstrelsy. Now, the fall and the thunder word is obviously representing the eternal return, being commented upon by both Joyce and this secular notion of God, this embodied awe at the will, at and within the will to life, and it's expressing a understanding of and a presentation of the beginning of life and the beginning of language, as well as a fury at the greed that has been perpetuated on Wall Street, which is obviously Wall Street. Now, straight, S-T-R-A-I-T, is where the book begins to get a little bit tricky with the words that it's using here in this paragraph, because strait can mean a narrow passage between bits of land that is connecting two bodies of water, a narrow passage of water connecting two bodies of water between land. It can also be a limited capacity, an area of limited capacity, or a troubling situation. So then Wall Street is the limited effort of the warring tycoons seeking to pilfer in concert together from the productive early risers. And then we have Old Par, which this one was a hard one for me to figure out. It is old person, but it also relates to this UK folk figure from, I believe, the 16th century called Old Tom Parr. And he's kind of this like unique Walter Mitty case. He's this guy that claimed to be like 150 years old. He was taken out of his village by a doctor and brought into London. And he was given this brief little fame. I mean, he was given a comfortable place to stay and a warm bed and nice food. Though incidentally, the nice food from London was disagreeable to the stomach that had just sustained itself on utter gruel, I think, and so the eating of slightly rancid, overcooked meats killed him. But before he died, he was actually met by King Charles I, and King Charles asked him, in the excess of life that he had been given, what more he had achieved than any other person. And Old Parr is retailed early in bed and later on life down. And this is to couple with Wall Street and Old Tom Parr. It's the unproven Darwinian rise of the economic world before its perverted turn into American industrial capital. And then you have the Christian minstrelsy, not ministry. And obviously minstrelsy is going to relate back to minstrel shows, minstrel groups, performers, and vaudeville. But I think what the Christian minstrelsy really is this offense and ridiculed-riddled game that is made out of Christian morality, and obviously Nietzsche talks about this a lot, but it's this fable of fortune of nature, and it's showing that what happens in these times of crisis and fall is that the master, rather than accepting the blame and putting aside their dominance to help elicit a better world, what happens is they affect the slave as a way of undermining the disenfranchisement that they themselves had created. And so this leads me to bring in probably the only biblical reference that I want to use, mainly because I've read most of Campbell's Skeleton Key to Finnegans Wake, and it is so fixed to the gospel and mythos aspect of Finnegans Wake, and it's so widely coupled or paired when people ask what to read with Finnegans Wake that I mean it does all the work there for us. But one interesting thing that I don't recall being seen in Joseph Campbell is in Campbell's work is questioning the Gospel of John. That what James Joyce is saying here is that the deception precedes the tale, and contrary to what John says, which is that what comes first is the word, what comes first is the deed. And we see that echoed in the very first word of the very first paragraph of the book, River Run. Now, going head first into the book, you look at River Run and you think that it is probably simultaneously the action of a river moving and the location of a moving body within a riverbed system. But deceptively, what River Run is an exploit of dubious intent to shape our nature rather than a actual shape of nature. Now, given that our first fall happens here on the very first page, what has happened in between? Joyce has left us in a place and time, Hoth Castle, before and after its establishment by Almeric Tristram in the 11th century, which was also the place of the Easter Rebellion 750 years later, or the armament of the Easter Rebellion 750 years later, which is crucial to this text and most of Joyce's work. Revolves around political figures from the Easter Rebellion. And funnily enough, Hoth Castle was actually sold in 2019 and has been essentially gutted. I think even the opening gates are owned by a different property owner than the actual building itself, and it's been kind of pilfered of most of the actually valuable parts, the historic aspects of the building, which is so funny that a moneyed reality would need to commodify and profit off of this historical monument. And the way that they do it is by disassembling all of the aspects of it, which made it as a whole valuable. What we see here already is that on page 1, Joyce is getting rid of all of the traditional ways of establishing a novel. He has created a labyrinth of metaphysical conceits within a historical resonance that really tries to harp on what is the truth and who is telling the truth. He is not just concerned with this kind of logical positivist notion or this objective idea that there is a truth in the world that we can get to concretely, or some kind of mathematical purity and concreteness to the world. Rather, what Joyce is trying to confront here is who is actually relaying what we call objective. And he's going to elaborate that notion by tricking us with decontextualized and anachronistic renderings of historical moments. But rather than continue down a close reading, I think just elaborating how we can dissect that one sentence shows how it's not that scary of a book. And I think obviously this comes with a necessary side conversation, which is about audience passivity, because so much of the conversation about Wake is around, I'll get around to it, there's just so much else that I need to read, or I could never read that book, it's so difficult, or that book is nonsense. And I really want to dispel all of that and explore the flippancy and passivity of the audience in the industrial world and see if there's any actual validity to that. And discussions of conventions and tropes and content in general, I feel that censors have kind of had the largest voice in the room, and so it goes without saying that individual consumers and even studios for a large time had virtually no say in the content that they consumed and made, yet were attacked for it vehemently. Now, in America before the advent of television, the majority of sociological research was coming out of Christian and religious organizations. And one of the most famous ones is the Paine Papers by the Paine Fund. Now, these people did give John Dewey his start in the exploration of what effects media has on youths. But the presentation of their findings was completely undermined by the isolationist and nationalist rhetoric that it was couched within, because the organization was run by and funded largely by religious zealots. The Paine Fund claimed that they were a moral agent trying to protect youth from subversive content, as well as women, but in reality what they did is they forced the censorship of immigrant stories and foreign films in general, the B-film and the noir, as well as concerns about existentialism and films that had questions about freedom in the growing authoritarian world. Now, in America, this religious fervor led to a slew of media censorship laws, and in 1907 Chicago introduced the first film censorship board, which influenced the development of the British National Film Censorship Board in 1912, which then led to the development of the Hayes Act in America, which pretty much eradicated all of the experimentation in social risk-taking from pre-code Hollywood for a generation and a half, really. Now, while Congress tried multiple times to establish a national film board like Britain did, all of those attempts were unsuccessful. But the religious foment in America, coupled with the anti-immigrant narrative of the government, meant that the studios didn't really feel like they were on their knees so much as pushed into an opportunity in which they were able to make the films reflect what they also felt, them being elites of America, which was an anti-immigrant sentiment in general. So they were able to undercut the subversive nature of the content that they were producing, which also, in some aspects, lowered the production costs by kind of shifting around the star system and making certain actors and actresses less desirable than others because of their citizenship and political statuses. Films then were coded in a kind of conservative manner because they weren't explicitly stating anything radical, but they weren't confirming any need for change in the society anymore. And this meant that the studios got to amass huge profits on the films that they were producing that were pure escapism, because now they were able to get in the regular crowd that they had. They were able to integrate the feminine crowd and the youth crowds that were previously kind of barred culturally from the film going experience, and they were able to profit off of the religious zealots that until then were attempting to essentially completely shut down the enterprise of filmmaking. Now, obviously, this was damning to artists all over the world. Not only did this completely destroy the creative experimentation within film, but it had ripple effects throughout literature and the physical art world as well. Now, female, youth, immigrant, and spiritual consumers were now being completely harassed on all sides. The content that they already had no say in the production of, that they were consuming, is now being called into question by the censors and by the media, and they're being ridiculed and dehumanized for the consumption of the stuff that the same newspapers sometimes were advertising and selling to them. Now, a really great, just tremendous book that I've just been picking through is Richard Bush's The Making of American Audiences. And this tracks from the theater to television, the import of theater from Britain, and a little bit about the differences between English theater and English audiences in general versus American audiences. But then it branches out and shows how the Revolution and colonial area had very distinct differences. But by the time of the Revolution, the American audience had really kind of established itself in a similar form as the rest of the kind of toiling proletariat audiences of the world. What this is a completely non-passive interaction with the media that they consume, contrary to the very popular notion in sociological and neurological work that we are becoming more and more passive. And what we really see is the reason for this misconstruing is that the upper middle class and elites had a concerted effort to intercede on the perceptions of engagement with media. A lot of the early studies on audience passivity come out of the same kind of religiously oriented sociological work as the Pain Fund. And from a historical perspective, what is really unique is that the modern opera audience, or the modern classical music attendance, is the most passive and sterilized audience grouping that we have kind of encountered in the historical record. Whereas the working class has continually engaged with art in the same kind of way. Whether it's a movie or their phone screen or a karaoke bar, the same techniques are being used by the working class to express themselves and achieve a catharsis from the alienation that they're subjected to through their engagement with the media that they consume. There is a raucosity to the working class's engagement with art that has been constantly squashed by bourgeois morality. But what deflates media of content that is radical or life affirming or even revolutionary is not this imposition of technology as someone like Marshall McLuhan might see it, but rather it's the will of those who mold and amass and accumulate the power over technology. Now, for Marshall McLuhan, Finnegans Wake exemplifies this idea that in media, the content is a distraction, and ultimately in, I think, media ecologies, he establishes that the content is ourselves and that it is irrelevant because we're just consuming ourselves, and we can save that debate for another time. Technology distracts from the imposition of the ideological frame from which this technology actually manifests. See, technology for me is the expedient of an exchange, and so we as products of and servants to the system that we live within, we do have a sort of control over what kind of technology is developed and for what aims, only so far in as we can recognize how the people that control the accumulation of technology actually have amassed that and find a way to strip it away and decouple it from the kind of speculative value that has been applied to it. In Book 2, Chapter 3 of the Wake, I think we find the strongest case for this, because Earwicker is at Humphrey Earwicker, our main character, is at the bar that he owns, serving drinks to the patrons and gossiping. And amidst entertaining this sailor and helping the sailor find a tailor and seeing the tailor disappear from the sailor, and this whole quest develops, and there's a radio broadcast and horse race, and the TV is on as well in the background, and TVs haven't been in bars yet, and what is going on with all of this? And all of a sudden, our man, Earwicker, and all of these men seem to disappear. And what happens is the technology of book, radio, and television are being taken by Joyce and used against the reader and against Earwicker. Fights ensue and denouncements of fascists are thrown around wildly as the wake itself and the bar jam with this already drunken prose, a feast of discontentment about the ideological fragility of this pseudo-political environment of the inn, the bar that they're all at, because it's this commodified place of idleness that has presented itself before them. And with the way that these technology are used as ways to kind of cast a smoke and mirror against the individual, we see that this idea of an extended nervous system perpetuated by technology, as McLuhan claims, doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. Because what would be the goal of extending an experience of oneself of alienation from community and meaning? Perhaps unintended consequences, but it would seem the reading that we've elaborated so far has shown that the interaction with media is the exercise of the conflict of our awareness of desire to escape the alienation indefinitely. So rather than seeing media as an extension of ourselves, we should begin to see media and technology as presenting a rupture in ourselves and community. One in which the need for a community that transcends economic systems is confronted with the economic-based desire to succumb to the ego. And so then a pathway is introduced to mediate between these via a already accepted set of values by the culture. With these insights, we can actually begin to see ourselves as culpable media consumers. While some media ecologists like McLuhan may be content with saying that systems of governance are just effects of technology that humanity has no ability to actually grasp, what I think is a much less nihilistic interpretation and is much closer to the alignment with Joyce's infatuation with historical moments is the idea that the systems we adhere to for order actually affect what the system of mediation will entail. Joyce is bringing the audience past the limits of the landed gentry that first creased the pages of Tristram Shandy. In a Rabelaisian turn, he is asking us to stop thinking so much about the psychological motives or literal sense of his characters, and to go back and look back at experience. Remember the initial experience that you have with a piece of art, and the experiences that you bring into it. Those experiences only manifest in your understanding of the art, only manifest through a synchronicity with that which is whittled down out of the artist's experience with the process of making the piece itself. Now, this opening up for determined infinitudes may seem like a real head scratcher, but I don't think we should give up, because I think we're getting really close to at least one workable atlas for Finnegans Wake, although I will admit that there are a myriad of ways that we could interpret these lines and go through the book. This is just the way that I find works most for me and makes the book seem a more cohesive and contradictory in a dialectical sense literary experience. But I think there's two more aspects of importance to Joyce's production of the novel that we should look at, and that's language and optics. And there's a quote here that I want to read, and a few notes too from an ebook version of Bordeaux and Passeron's In Reproduction in Education that I read. And the quote is, what we inherit from our social origins is not only a language, but inseparably a relationship to language, and specifically the value of language. Now, what Passeron and Bordeaux are arguing in this text largely is that our formal or academic language is a problem, because it is treated as the legitimate language, it is treated as the mother language, it is treated as the language of record, so to speak, that which we're taught in schools. And while it may be great in eliciting erudite expressions of emotions and being able to engage in rhetorical battles with people, it can be incredibly alienating to, be a foreign language speaker in an English school, for example, or to suffer from really severe dyslexia or some kind of verbal impairment. These are all aspects of what make it harder for us to engage with a quote-unquote academic language. And this is all bound up in this idea of the mother language. The mother language is what you speak most of the time. These restrictions on language manifest out of the social capital that is possessed by the regulating bodies of edification at large. Now, education, due to its subservience to state and language as a technique, necessarily is engaging in a type of symbolic violence, that is a violence against symbols as a freely expressible and invented category of human conception. Now, what cultural ambiguities are is just the accepted values of a state or the privately wealthy that is legitimated over long time scales and then trickles down into the other classes. This obviously presents a problem for all pedagogical practices: what to teach and how. Bordeaux and Passeron identify the current edict fix around educational aims, which we obviously see in the debates about what we put in libraries and how to teach history. This all manifests out of this ideological clash around what is good for national growth and the perceived relationship or sameness between education and national growth. And when language becomes a tool of dogmatically inclined systems, it means that our actual language making ability and our actual learning capacity is diffused into these emotionally charged fractals. Now, with all of this in mind, I definitely can reflect back and feel a bit of guilt for any time that I have affixed the label of pretentiousness onto a author or an idea, or even the existentialism of teenage maturation. These kind of derisions, I realize, don't serve any purpose but to elicit a superiority over the concept of ability. Because largely what we're saying when we call something pretentious or somebody pretentious is that they're wearing a mask of sorts, that they are putting on airs above their ability or their talent, and they're trying to express a level of intellect that they don't actually possess. But when we look at the word ability as it's applied in this sentence, we have to ask, like, who is actually saying what is sufficient in language creation, what is legitimate in language invention, or what constitutes coherent, because we live in such decoherent times. I mean, flip on the news to any one of the talking head programs and try and figure out if one sentence between the two interlocutors is actually expressing some kind of commonality between each other, or if they're just talking past each other. I would almost warrant to guarantee that all of it is talking past each other. In a society now that has perpetuated this in our education system and now into our culture at large, that we should be the arbiters of judgment on what constitutes a genuine symbolic expression, and that our position in society economically dictates how valid our opinion on that matter actually is. But the thing is that whether lowbrow or arcanely highbrow, all interlocutors are just trying to make sense of the world by means of the need to express themselves, and this expression can only come manifest through the linguistic tools that we have at hand, and through the profiles that we cast on language and language making as a whole. And this is where Nietzsche and Wittgenstein's commonality on language, and this, you cannot speak about that which is unspeakable, and that you cannot escape Christianity through the language of Christianity. These are kind of existing on a similar realm, which is that we are bound by our language, and our language is bound by the system which informs what aspects of it are useful. Now, I think it's important to go back to theater again, because a lot of the neologisms and slang that develops out of Shakespeare is obviously coming from commoners' language. And I think an oft-forgot notion is what I brought up previously, which is the kind of control and active participation that the audience had over theater initially. The stomping of the feet, the screaming, the stopping of plays. They would literally interrupt performers if they got a soliloquy wrong, or if a play came to a head with some kind of political climax. That would incite genuine political debate between the preterite, and they would be screaming up into the rafters at the elites, and like demanding a actual engagement on these issues that were so important to them, when they're trying to evade them by portraying them in this fluffed up way on the stage. But the elites didn't realize that what this afforded was a locked room in which they were forced to actually encounter the people that they were most afraid of encountering. And this obviously is the impetus for the removal of alcohol from theaters, the removal of young men, the instilling of silent rules, the development of particular lighting and stage design that made you psychologically disabused, I guess, or disinterested in the notion of communication, that the lights would be all focused towards the stage. So there's this idea of not only anonymity, but unpresence of the audience, that you should be unpresent, that you are just a shadow upon this immersion that is happening for the elites. The unfortunate thing here is they couldn't just hike up the prices of tickets, because the elites didn't want to spend a ton of money on tickets because they were already paying for the buildings themselves through their patronage. But the cost of bringing actors into town and bringing new plays into town necessitated having a proletariat audience at every show. They literally made or it was literally make or break for theaters whether or not they decided to have a working class audience. And oftentimes, theaters that would raise their prices would either shutter their doors weeks later or revert back to their old ways. Here in the entertainment complex, the preterite unite against their usually restricted language-making abilities and usurp the authority over word and diction. And this invention and rejuvenation and rekindling of language-making is what we see today in schoolyards or on databases world around. And in the American entertainment colossus, at least, this has been a historically dialectical exchange in which we haven't actually come to terms between this battle of the I, the you, and the we. Thus, in the 1920s, with the anti-immigrant movement and the rise of these religious coalitions, we saw a quite a large shift in labor and media culture. And we saw a rewriting of the relationship to new media globally, because the isolationist, expansionist dichotomy of the American empire building necessitated that the new media internationale would be as American as apple pie. And I think today, you would be hard-pressed to find any national fund or nonprofit that is offering grants to artists that hasn't been infiltrated in some way by this imperial hegemony. So for culture critics like Richard Butch and his mentor Raymond Williams, what we see with the current identity politics and moral hysteria and the factionalization within the world is not a representation of working class sentiments, but a reproduction of the elite notion of what freedom is, bubbling up. It's at a boiling point, and it's spilling over and diluting the radical interaction and invention of the working class's art and media consumption. Later on in Finnegans Wake, Sean, the son of Earwicker, portraying himself as Jean, tells us, collide with man, collude with money. And what this is saying is that social mechanisms such as profiteering become abundant when the deception can be offset by the dehumanization of an other. And this tale is being imparted onto his sister, Izzy, who is a character of immense infatuation within the book. Now, the goal of Ron's monologue is to dictate a list of maxims about the world that will whittle down Issy's hopes about what her experience in the world will be, and ultimately to develop a fear of the world. And this will then privatize her love towards Sean. Now, in this section, Izzy is given to us in a opposed manner to how she initially is introduced in the book during the night school section, in which she intercedes on Shem and Sean's story by way of footnotes. She is rewriting their tale before we actually get a chance to engage with the matter at hand. Issy even has intimate knowledge of the notebooks that Joyce is developing this family tragedy out of. But here, during Sean's monologue, we see Issy as foregrounded. She is treated as an object. This character then acts as a structure, anti-structure, and it takes the grim reality of feminine experiences being this kind of footnote to literary expression so far, and gives that literal footnote the ability to express a feminine authority over the entire text. This also is being matched against a tirade of patriarchal disavowals of Earwicker's supposed crime against Issy. And obviously, I think that this is not just to reflect the relationship of trauma within the family, but as well as the relationship that the artist has with the critic and the demands of a critic for a straightforward, clean narrative. And ultimately, by taking up authorship, Issy is denouncing the objectification of herself as a literary device and as a victim of abuse. Now, critics of modernism may say that stream of consciousness is obfuscatory like we laid out, and that taking the suffering away from systems encourages some kind of middle-class individualism. But when we look at the Wake, I think it's important to remember that Issy's footnotes represent her presence beyond an individual. that the what she is representing is this universal experience within the feminine form as being subjugated or made secondary to the patriarchal experience and order. And for Joyce, this feminine form is the antithesis to masculinity, quote unquote, which these kind of embody the competition, anti competition, fascism, the inability to forgive, jealousy, all of these negative psychological fomentations that then cause our system to break down in its quest for more and more unadulterated accumulation. But rather, what the feminine is the humane side, the side that can look at all of that grotesqueness and accept it for what it is and be able to reconcile with it in a compassionate manner that is not relinquishing itself to it, but rather saying that it is no longer bound up within its moralizations and is able to make head of history and make head of itself, the collective, on its own, our own, without the imposition of some kind of state of war with one's self and community. For now, Issy stays distant from being human. Her historicism is kind of completely under question for the rest of the book, and the question of the letter that holds the information about what it was Earwicker did or didn't do to Issy. It becomes the main emphasis of the book rather than Issy herself. And Juan slips down the river, and Issy's pen is taken away, and she collapses into tears. And I like to think that she is subsumed by the tears. She is subsumed by this unnecessary guilt about her subservience. And rather than being able to actually overcome in this moment, she relinquishes herself to that subservience and becomes part of the river that allows Sean to continue his journey through the narrative. Now, this recurso into environmental factors is something I want to pick up in future videos, but I think we can say that it's safe to negate these kind of moments and any of the occultic natures of the book of any mystical leanings on Joyce's part. Obviously, we know that Joyce was engaged with theosophy and occultist groups. He was a great fan of W.B. Yeats' work, and obviously was interested in the kind of Celtic revival that he was involved with. But Joyce had very, very strong criticisms of all of these. He thought that occultism and seances were just stealing money from people that were trying to find ways to work through their grief. And while he was going to seances and mediums himself, I think it's important to reconcile that moment in his life with the end of life kind of concerns that a person goes through, especially the kind of acute form that a sensitive artist goes through with that, as well as his genuine encyclopedic interest in these things as being part of the human expression of questioning some kind of ontological status quo. You see, he's acutely aware of the perversions of the humanist sentiments, and a lot of the way that Joyce parodies the seances and the occultic and the religious reminds me of what Theodore Adorno says about occultism and fascism, which is that they present a consciousness famished for truth, and that it is an idealism full circle. And I think it's no coincidence that this follows Joyce's reinterpretation of Aesop's fable of the ant and the grasshopper, retitled The Ant and the Grasshopper. So in Joyce's formulation, the grasshopper is kind of engaging in a bohemian hedonistic lifestyle, but it's not elegant, it's not ornate. He still has to work for his money in a sense, but he ultimately comes down on his luck and is no longer able to engage in his vices as he normally had. Whereas the Ont has constantly suppressed his vices by expanding his thrift and engaging in commercial savviness that allows him to accumulate beyond a typically acceptable level. And as a result, he decides to throw a lavish party that puts to shame the kind of events that Grasshopper would engage in and produce himself. And decides to go to the aunt's party and ask a favor. He pleads. He accepts that he has thrown away his lot and needlessly incurred losses, but he sees that everyone is gathered together in this joyous occasion, and how can a community be gathered in this joy when there's one of us suffering? And even though the suffering was largely imposed by my own will, the Grasshopper says, he does kind of elicit this point that we're all doing this. It's not that what I'm doing has only become bad because you guys see me as not being able to engage in it anymore with you. And so if you can help me recoup my losses, I can engage with you again. I'll accept this public shaming that you've given me, but I will also forgive you for thinking that this public shaming was necessary or acceptable. And of course, the aunt goes on and begins to laugh and deride the Grasshopper even more. Now, what is being relayed here is a dialectical problem within society, in which when we come against a situation that is historically repeated, because the Grasshopper does have this happen throughout his life, we tend to moralize the situation away from the actual logic that it is consistent with, because it made sense for Grasshopper to live his life like that until he wasn't able to live his life like that anymore. And then it became morally reprehensible that he had lived his life as everyone else does, accumulating and consuming. And the essential problem that Ont has is that he is unable to see his accumulation in relation to time. What has happened to Grasshopper is he's realized that he's not going to be able to do this forever, that he actually does need to take care of himself and provide some kind of structure to himself. But that necessitates creating a rupture in the way that the system already exists. And the aunt and everybody else doesn't want to change because they've found a way to exist within this thrifty hedonism that, for now, allows them to live in a bubble. They don't have to actually consider the encroachment of time because they think that the accumulation has kind of been a purchase against that time. But Grasshopper comes to them and presents the problem that this could happen to them, and it probably will happen to them in time, that this is all coming for them. And they decide to laugh it off because neither party is actually able to engage in the dialectical rendering of the situation and being able to sublimate the contradictions that are inherent in their organization and create a new society that is productive in a capacity that is not geared towards accumulation and consumption, but geared towards the fulfillment of a happy and content life for all of its inhabitants. Now, the theosophical shift, or Jungian or Freudian dream analogies, seem to be reliable footholds into the more obfuscatory moments of the Wake, and they seem like they may be able to elicit some concepts about the collective consciousness in moments like the Grasshopper and the Aunt. But I think that actually that actually gets away from what Joyce's point is, because I don't think Joyce's point is that we all need to meditate on some kind of religious relativism and coexist, so to say. I think he thinks that our problems are much deeper than that, that even if we coexist, there's still this imposition of consumption and accumulation in the society that means that that coexistence is going to have to come into some kind of conflict, because someone has to come out as the winner in the current order of things. And obviously there's a dream logic to all of this, but it would seem to afford a carte blanche to Joyce's work, that he can just do whatever he wants, and that you don't have to actually like get anything coherent out of the book because it's all just a dream, and dreams are incoherent. But they're not. They're intrinsically tied to reality. They are reality. They're just our reality abstracted from the consistency of all of our senses engaging in the reproduction of it. It's just now it's being relied upon entirely by the conceptual mechanics. So I may think that Joyce is depriving the reader of this ability to say what is a legitimate attempt at prosody, or what isn't a legitimate philosophical statement, because it's all mired in this jargon and it's all mired in this dreaminess. But I don't think that's so, and I think it undercuts the kind of ironical histrionic digressions that seem inherent to the structure of the Wake itself. It's not some kind of collective mysticism that we need, but it's a collective understanding that we need, and that is only mystical so far in this kind of Wittgensteinian sense, which is that there are things that exist beyond linguistic, conceptual parameters that we cannot actually speak about, but are in a way experience or find themselves. I think he uses the word that the phrase that they do find themselves manifest in the world, and those therefore are mystical things. I think that is the kind of mysticism that is present in Joyce, and I don't think it is this wholesale collective consciousness. There's none of this ESP stuff. I think anything that you find of that in the book is typically being parodied, and it's so few and far between within the novel that it really feels like cherry picking to kind of use those moments as eliciting some kind of strong motive on Joyce's part. Whereas what I'm trying to do is elicit all of this stuff from a framework of understanding about Joyce's interaction with these groups, as well as his interaction with the political groups and his studying of the political nature of Ireland and the imperial world that he was finding himself in. And here we come back to dream in a weird, incoherent way that I've jumped around here. Joyce doesn't explicitly call the Wake a dream, ever. That is not a statement that is made by him, and this is a sort of an anachronism about Joyce and about the construction of Finnegans Wake. But rather, what he said is that it is the book of the night, and that we that like in dreams, it is not about any one individual. And so to get to the heart of this misunderstanding, I think it's important to realize that night does not mean slumber. It does not mean the dream. It does not mean irreality. Rather, for Joyce, what is significant about night is not that it is related to slumber or sleep or this dream state, but that it is indicative of change from the typical or regular experience. That night is this unavoidable shift, non-theosophical shift, into a new state of being or experience of being. And by thematizing the indiscretions of Earwicker within the night, I think that the night begins to evoke this fading clarity of the indiscretion and these perceptual ruptures and a discomfort within one's familiar environment that once was distinguishable but is now not. Determinism and history then become these lively entities to be investigated and wrestled with throughout the novel and throughout life. And we recognize that they are tools of a ideologically corrupt actor or actors within society. And that these are perfectly mapped onto the idea of the night and evening or the domestic life of the working class. The novel's anxious, sporadic balance between distrust, boredom, hysteria, and aging is all mediated through this night, or the change, or what Eisenstein would call the moment in which we become conscious of the unconscious impacts of the social mechanisms in our lives as constituting our memory. The dreaminess, then, that Joyce is trying to wake us from in his novel is this dream of individualism, nihilism, accumulation, and patriarchal desire. When Humphrey Earwicker is made a target in his eyes of an investigation, his experiences, both past and present, become intertwined and they override the topography of the investigation itself. As he wrestles with the truth, so too does the prose wrestle with the liminal space of the courtroom, and it's showing this shattering of one's historical being by the intervention of the state into matters of one's character, the ignorance of one's character by the state, usually being something a person sees as constituting what makes one an individual and free. So it's this interesting reversal of the state's role in a person's life to exacerbate this notion of a bureaucratic nightmare. The schismogenesis, I kind of think, is compounded by the evidence for Earwicker's indiscretion taking place in the form of this letter that we don't know yet whether or not it exists or what it even contains. The most moving testimony for and against Earwicker in the trial as it comes to a culmination is from his wife, Anna Livia Plurabelle. Now, typically, women are placed ironically as objects of desire for men that are far beneath them in Joyce's work, and this is usually done as a way to try and uplift women, but it tends to present women in this kind of two-dimensional way to a less acute reader. But I think if you really look closely, what Joyce is trying to do is to kind of show us that men don't really understand what is going on in women's lives, and that's truly what I think is being elicited through the letter writing that takes place throughout Ulysses. I think David Graeber has a great point on this as well. The way that he improves the feminine representation here, I think, is that the court that presides over retaining the patriarchal dominance in this land, which is kind of Earwicker's mind, in order to uphold its integrity, has to make itself subservient to the feminine order. And so what happens is the court ends up kind of falling back and having to surrender itself to the testimony of Anna Livia, and Anna Livia ends up kind of having to become author of this letter. And I've seen kind of different readings that interpret it as she always had the letter, or that she magically materializes the letter. But the way that I like to see it is that, like, her testimony is kind of taken for the truth, and that she is a representation not just of herself, but of all of the females that have been undermined and abused within the setting of the novel. And so there we see that what the letter is her memory, the fading history of her devotion to her family and the love of her husband. And her woes soberly reflect the inclusivity of historical events and materials in matters of the inner psyche. Because the novel is very clear in the damage a guilty sentence would do to Earwicker, and his kind of anxiety really compounds the difficulty of the prose. What the court's really concerned with, and why I think it also digresses so easily in the courtroom sequences into something just completely chaotic, is that the court is both wanting to understand how this alleged crime happened, and in knowing that they are fully culpable as being the society or the mind that produced the person that did this, but also not wanting to actually come to the truth, because that would necessitate the dissolution, the dissolving of this order and of the court. And obviously the court is then trying to make an argument in this sense that it is necessary in order to try Earwicker and see that Earwicker is responsible, but also that in order to uphold its legitimacy, it can't actually follow through with any penalization of Earwicker. The court obviously never succeeds, and then it's left to the collective alienated feminine form within the novel to author its side of history and to begin to actually author the substance of the text. And this begins by ALP having to divorce herself, in a sense, from the love that she has in that moment for her husband, and being able to accept the dialectical nature of her relationship to her husband and this male system of oppression, in that she obviously is devoted to and was fulfilled by her husband and was given this family that she very much loves and had this great incredible life. And even in these final moments, she is thinking back and trying to think about indiscretions that Earwicker would have done, but she can only think back to the previous night and that morning, waking up and seeing him, and this joy that having someone in their life that makes you feel fulfilled for some reason that is incommunicable in language. But at the same time, she is recognizing that her love is not for that part of the man and that part of the system which oppresses her and prevents her from actually expressing herself, prevents Issy from being able to come forward with a truth that is communicable, and forces Issy into a presentation that is incredibly manipulated. It would sound very, very crass and improper to explain how her character is alienated throughout the book. And it's really one of the most depressing renderings I've ever seen. Bordering on haunting. I would say bordering on haunting, the way that the female characters are dealt with by the males and by history within the book. And it's a very powerful statement I think Joyce is trying to make, in lieu of his daughter not being able to actually control her own life and having to be sent to a institution where a bunch of men are then going to say that the reason their daughter is a schizophrenic is because Nora is a frigid mother, which is what the actual medical analysis would have been at that time. So by giving the female character an opportunity to actually express this feeling of not being allowed to feel, even in a book, she is then able to actually speak candidly about where the I-me dialectic or dichotomy for her and Earwicker will go. And the very, very beautiful thing that Joyce does is, even though we find out that Earwicker is probably this horrible person, because Aunt Olivia has been able to actually overcome her subservience to a patriarchal order and is truly a freed collective, that the feminine form is freed in a sense at the end of the novel, the parental figures become entwined, and they're analogous to a yin and yang, kind of like the Shem and Shan characters as are presented throughout the rest of the book. And so then we're left with this somber reflection on modern life at their intertwining. What memory does when reflecting just me is completely forgets time and surrenders to the ego. And by fixing history, one need not find oneself in it. But when capable of abstraction and a attention to history and a ability to concretize, memory becomes beyond the personal and is dialogic. And it allows one being to be given meaning under a collective effort to identify with fluidity and in concert. And this relates back to the composition of the wake, because Joyce underwent, I think it was like a dozen surgeries without the need of anesthetic, or without the use of anesthetics. So this is, we're talking ulcers, abscesses being cauterized. I think he had 17 teeth pulled. He had his eyes slit open and bled by leeches. Like leeches would suck the pus and stuff out of his eyes because he had not conjunctivitis but uveitis. He would have surgeries on a sphincter and his intestines to cut out cancerous parts or ulceric parts and cauterize things and do different kinds of transplants. And all of this is compounded by the coming and going of mobility of different limbs, spasms and seizures and convulsions, and this general intense pressure within his head at all times. How does one actually compose a book within that experience? And yet he was a workaholic. They say that he wouldn't drink until later in the day after he had done most of his writing, and then he would meet with his friends and discuss his work and do some editing. And safe to say this probably wasn't a consistent practice. I'm sure Joyce imbibed quite a bit during his writing, as any author does. As we saw that the night was integral to Finnegans Wake, I think it is integral to Joyce's life too, because the night was that change. It was the shift from him working out this book, working out the world's problems as he saw it, and being able to stop running away from his mortality and his crumbling body, and he would go and relax in his mortality by imbibing. And although an intoxication, it was a respite from the day and a respite from the greater problems. And in this time, Joyce would be able to hang out with friends like Beckett. And I think this moment of company was really, really important. And while Joyce was certainly really, really bashful and insolent about it, I think he was eternally grateful. Because it would seem that alongside the work on the wake and the day, at night, Joyce was trying to break down the walls within himself to be able to work on himself and allow people to come and help him. He was coming to terms with disability and the power of community and family. And there's no question that Joyce's work would never have surfaced in the level of quality that it is without the intervention of people like Beckett or the countless friends that he made that were polylinguists. And I think it's important also to recognize that amidst all of this pain and anguish, we should not accept a understanding of the Wake as a nihilist book. I think it's something like 1,000 asylum declarations were given on the behalf of James Joyce to various expats and communists and political delinquents of all sorts and minorities of all sorts that were stuck in stuck in France, I believe, at the time that the Nazis were encroaching, and because of their political position and their minority position within the state of France, they were being skipped over in the line of who was being able to get out of the country. And Joyce helped near 1,000 people get out of the country and escape Nazi persecution. So this idea that Joyce's work is somehow this nihilistic rendering of a syphilitic madman is utter nonsense, and not only an insult to Joyce, but an insult to the people that would make this argument, that someone would accept such a silly and two-dimensional and cartoonish rendering of a person that actually existed in the world. I think it's far safer to say that Joyce's mortality compounded the urgency at which he composed the work, and at which he forced himself to entertain the various friends that he met and take in their knowledge as well. Because I think it's due to the grace of those who sacrifice self that humanity's great achievements actually come to fruition. And it's in the sense that the Wake is not an extension of self, but of community. And I think from there we can better approach the content of the Wake and move away from the medium and this idea of messenger and receiver. Because Joyce is not trying to engineer an escape from a dream of history. I think it's rather a reconciliation or an overcoming of its contents, so that we can come to a new, more radical organization of humanity within the world system. And hopefully this would take place in a way that we see technology not as being used to pit culture and humanity against nature, but being able to use technology to break down this distinction of culture and human as away from or different from nature. He crashed in the hollow of the park, trees down, as he soared in the vacuum of the phoenix, stones up, looks like a molten bolter, and sounds like a rude word. History is represented here in its ideal yet also practical. History is represented here in its ideal and practical progression. Change in nature has a new meaning at every aspect of its meaning, eliciting a change in how we contextualize historical progression. And while the change may stumble, we shouldn't pedals into passivisms as gorgons of self-righteousness, as Finnegans Wake says, but rather we should actively engage with history and time, not against them, and redress the living side of history. And that's not to say living history as in just purely reenactments, but treating history as something that is not just a bunch of static dates on a piece of page, but as something that we constantly have to wrestle with and come to a new understanding with as new pieces of information from the past come to light and as the present comes to bear on the past. See, technology and mediation of ideology in deaded or conquest societies for Joyce are divorcing us and further alienating us from being within nature. So, memory, in its dreamy perniciousness as a conceit to history, history being elastic and living, can become peopled again if we no longer allow technology to perpetuate the slumbering I. As Anna Olivia wakes, her recognition of you or Humphrey Earwicker is dependent on her memory being defined by their mutual experiences of the other. And their final embrace, lips, with the I negated, in love communing above the individual as they live into a we that humanity can attain, that humanity can strive to be. And so they're no longer transactional beings in a cycle of abuse, but they as a people have transcended abuse and transcended systemic oppression. They return to the natural imperative to humanity's survival, which is a loving hope and radical action amongst all. While hovering dream wings, folding around, will hide from fears my wee me manny kin. Keep my big wig long strong man o' man, guard my bairn mon beau. Thank you.